righty. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about the temporary inconvenience of moving from one house to another. And it's an inconvenience that we've all experienced at one time or another. This inconvenience or chaos is one that we have created ourselves by choosing to move. When we moved from Kansas down to Woodville, 3 weeks later, Hurricane Rita hit. And suddenly, tens of thousands of people experienced not just a minor inconvenience, but a type of chaos that was magnified exponentially. People's lives were turned upside down, and thousands lost everything that they owned. Then, and continuing on, whenever disaster strikes, God's people responded in a magnificent way, as God's people usually do. And there were dozens of ministries from virtually every faith tradition on the ground and deeply involved in a hands-on way in helping people get their lives back together. These people's situations are the basis for what I want us to look at tonight. For the people affected by Rita, it doesn't matter how together their lives might have been before the storm, they discovered in an all too real way how life is unpredictable, how the world is unstable, and you never know when everything about your existence will suddenly spin into chaos. What's more, when you look at what's happening across the globe, there's the appearance that our nation may be on the brink of war once again. Who knows if much of what we're seeing globally is merely political posturing or if it's a genuine threat. Time will tell. We've seen such situations unravel before, and there's certainly a possibility that it could happen again. We get these frequent reminders that the world around us isn't nearly as stable as we'd like it to be. And I'm not just talking about politics and weather. Some of you are seeing it happen day after day on a more personal basis. You see it in your families, in your finances, and in your health. Your world is becoming increasingly unstable, and there's just a whole lot of shaking going on around you. When this happens, it doesn't matter how together you might be personally, because the chaos around you still affects you. So what do you do when the world comes crashing down? What do you do when this chaos hits? We're in week 2 of a series that I've titled, I Will Not Be Moved. And it's about chaos. It's about finding strength in a world and in a culture of chaos. Because all too often we find that the world that we live in is frequently chaotic. Last week, I talked about, or the last time we met, 2 weeks ago, I talked about how to deal with the chaos that we create for ourselves, both through sinful willfulness and through misguided and unwise decisions. I talked about the need to confront the chaos head on, asking the right questions, listening to the right people, and taking the right steps in follow-up. Tonight, I want to talk about confronting a different kind of chaos. I'm talking about the chaos that we encounter that is not of our doing, but is simply the result of this crazy, mixed up, fallen world that we live in. You personally may not be prone to chaos, but I can assure you that the world is prone to chaos. And many of the people around you are experiencing it. And sometimes it doesn't take a whole lot for that pandemonium to begin. So today I want to talk to you about dealing with the chaos that's around you, the chaos that occurs in situations that you can't really control. How do you stand strong in those situations? In 1895, Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem that I think I had to read when I was in junior high school. The poem sums up the standing strong mentality. I'm not going to read the entire poem, but I'm going to read a few of the stanzas out of this poem. The poem is called If. Yep. Got some teachers going, oh yeah, I know that one. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And what is more, you'll be a man, my son. Humorist Jean Kerr, who wrote Please Don't Eat the Daisies, had her own take on that poem. She said, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs, it's just possible that you haven't grasped the situation. Her version might actually be more accurate. But today, I want to talk to you about how to understand the situation and how to respond to the chaos that's around you, and how you can keep your head on straight when nobody else has a clue about what to do. We're going to look at a story in Acts 27, if you want to turn there. Acts 27, and this story is about the Apostle Paul, who was on a ship in the middle of a storm, and everyone around him was losing their heads, and he stood strong in the midst of it all. The events of this story parallel the steps that we need to take in order to respond rightly to the chaos that we encounter. So let's spend the next several minutes here seeing what this story has to say to us tonight. Acts 27 begins with Paul setting sail for Italy. Now, when you're reading through the book of Acts, you're going to notice that in chapter 27, the pronouns suddenly change from he to we. And it's assumed that it's at this point that Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, is joining Paul on this journey. So when Paul got on the boat, his life was already quite chaotic. He was on his way to Italy, going to Rome to stand trial before Caesar and quite possibly be sentenced to death. This chaos in Paul's life was not of his own doing, other than the fact that he had been faithful to preach the gospel. This chaos in Paul's life was the result of the fallen world in which Paul lived, and a government that was hostile to the teachings of Jesus Christ. So after he boarded this final ship, things went from bad to worse, because the ship, which contained 276 people plus cargo, ran into some troubling weather. And we're going to see that no one really knew how to handle what was going on until Paul finally stepped up. So as we work through this story, there are three observations about chaotic situations that I want to draw to your attention. If you want to be the kind of person who can stand strong in a culture of chaos, if you want to be the one who keeps their head on straight when everyone else is losing theirs, these are three general truths that you can keep in mind. The first thing to remember when things get chaotic is that chaos will never fix itself, and you can't count on others to fix it for you. Problems rarely, if ever, just go away on their own. In fact, they usually get worse. The second law of thermodynamics says that the randomness or disorder of the universe is always increasing. Another way of saying this is that when things are left unattended, they go from bad to worse. As the ship sailed into the storm, they couldn't just cross their fingers and hope that the storm wouldn't do what the storm of this size can't help but do. They needed a plan and they needed to take action, but they just weren't willing to do it. As the ship sailed into troubled waters, look what happens. In Acts 27, I'm going to read verses 9 through 19. It says, "By now much time had passed, and the voyage was already dangerous. Since the fast was already over, Paul gave his advice and told them, 'Men, I can see that this voyage is headed toward damage and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives.' But the centurion paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than to what Paul said. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided to set sail from there, hoping somehow to reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete open to the southwest and northwest, and to winter there. When a gentle south wind sprang up, they thought they had achieved their purpose. They weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. But not long afterward, a fierce wind called the northeaster rushed down from the island. Since the ship was caught and was unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. After running under the shelter of a little island called Cauda, we were barely able to get control of the skiff. After hoisting it up, they used ropes and tackle and girded the ship. Then, fearing they would run aground on Syrtis, they lowered the drift anchor, and in this way they were driven along. Because we were being severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo the next day. On the third day, they threw the ship's gear overboard with their own hands." Now, Paul warned them what was going to happen. He told them it was going to end badly. He wanted them to put the brakes on and wait out the storm and spend the winter where they were. But because the waters were considered extremely unsafe in the late fall and the early months, you just didn't set out sail at that time of the year. However, the centurion and the captain decided that they would go on ahead. And there are three phrases in this part of the story that jump out at me. One phase is in verse 9. By now, much time had passed. Isn't that what chaos does? It's the ultimate time killer. Until you find a way to confront the chaos, you just keep losing time. Another phrase that jumps out is found in verse 15. It says, "Since the ship was caught and was unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along." How many times have we been in the same kind of situation? We just give up and give way to the problem and let it drag us along. Too tired to fight back, too discouraged to resist. We just let the situation drive us along. And there's another phrase that maybe jumped out at you. It's found in verse 12. Paul had told the leaders what they needed to do, and then Luke writes in verse 12, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided to set sail from there. You know, there are certain situations, especially crisis situations, when the majority is the last group that you want to listen to. The hive mind mentality of the majority rarely moves you in the direction of wise decision making. You need to know ahead of time that there may be times when you have to stand alone against the tide of public opinion and choose to do what you know is right rather than what everybody else at that period of time thinks is right. Chaos will never fix itself. And most of the time, you can't count on the nameless, faceless they to fix it for you. So what can you do? Well, here's the next observation. You need to acknowledge that God is in control of even the most out of control situations. God is not the author of chaos. He is the redeemer of chaos. God is not the author of disorder or destruction. He is the redeemer of disorder and destruction. People ask, yeah, but what about the storms? Did God create those storms and send them to punish people? That may be how it would have been explained in the Middle Ages. But today, we're understanding more and more about how the human footprint affects global weather conditions. God did not create the chaos in Texas and Louisiana that resulted from Rita. But he was there in the presence of his people to redeem the situation. In today's story, we see how Paul reminded his fellow passengers that regardless of how things may appear on the surface, God is in control. When things were at their worst, God gave a word to Paul, and he passed that word on to everyone else. Look in Acts 27, verse 25. He said, therefore, take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way it was told to me. A few verses later, Luke tells us in verse 35, after he said these things and had taken some bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them, and when he broke it, he began to eat. You know, the best thing you can do in the middle of an out-of-control situation is to acknowledge that above and beyond everything else, God is still in control. His being in control doesn't mean that we're not going to face hard times or that we're never going to encounter chaos. It means that in spite of all of the disorder around us, the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, nor his ear too dull to hear, which is what Isaiah 59:1 says. More times than I can count, I've had to stop in the middle of my momentary panic and remind myself who really is in control of whatever chaotic situation that I'm experiencing. God's message to the Apostle Paul during the midst of the storm was, in effect, you're going to get through this. And I want you to know, whatever storm you're in, you're going to get through it as well. The 18th century evangelist George Whitefield once said, "We are immortal until our work on earth is done." God is in control of even the most out of control situations. And if you want to learn to keep your head about it, if you want to learn to stand strong, remind yourself of that truth every day of your life, every moment of every day. So the first two observations from this story are that the chaos isn't about to fix itself, and most likely the majority won't make it any better. But God is in control, and He can redeem any amount of chaos. So where does that lead us? Well, the key to standing strong in a culture of chaos is to take charge whenever and wherever you can take charge. After the boat had taken a beating in the storm, they had thrown their cargo overboard, and they had gone 2 weeks without taking a bite of food, and it had gotten to the point, Luke writes in verse 20, for many days neither sun nor stars appeared, and a severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope that we would be saved was disappearing. And it's at this point Paul spoke up once again, saying in effect, "Gentlemen, I hate to say I told you so, but I told you so. You should have listened to me before, and you didn't. Maybe you'll listen this time." Look at verses 21 through 26. It says, "Since many were going without food, Paul stood up among them and said, 'You men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss. Now I urge you to take courage, because there will be no loss of any of your lives, but only of the ship. For this night an angel of the God that I belong to and serve stood by me, and he said, "Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And look, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way it was told to me. However, we must run aground on a certain island." Now, you may not be able to still the storm that's going on, that's raging all around you. You may not be able to change the tide of public opinion, or change the economy, or control what some political leader might do. You may not be able to even control what your wife or your kids or your boss or your neighbors do. But you can control what you do. And you can speak the voice of leadership and set the example of leadership to those around you. There's another phrase in the text that really kind of jumped out. It's in verse 33. And Paul says, this is out of the Contemporary English Version because I like the way it reads. At the end of verse 33, it says, "For 14 days you have been so worried that you haven't eaten a thing." I'd venture to say that a lot of us know what that feels like. Maybe has lasted even longer than 14 days. That's what chaos creates. A nagging, never-ending state of not knowing based on what takes place in this story. There are 3 things that I would advise you to do. First, I encourage you to take care of yourself. At the first part of verse 33, it says, "When it was about daylight, Paul urged them all to take food." The crisis had been going on for 2 weeks, and it wasn't over yet. Almost, but not yet. And the best thing that they could do at this moment was to tend to themselves. So Paul told them to eat. He knew that they were going to need their strength. Oftentimes, the first thing people do in the midst of a crisis is to stop taking care of themselves. Either they don't eat, or they stuff themselves with unhealthy food. Either they sleep all day, or they don't sleep at all. Either they completely withdraw emotionally, or they just blow up at every little thing. And they try to medicate this situation with alcohol, or drugs, or food, or shopping, or any number of other things. If there's chaos going on all around you, and you're in constant state of not knowing what's going to happen next, my first word to you is take care of yourself. Eat right. Go to sleep at night. Take a walk every day, or a couple of walks every day. Those three things are going to help you to maintain your emotional equilibrium. And second, I encourage you to lighten your load. Look at verse 38. It says, when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. Why were they doing that? It's because they didn't need it anymore. Instead, they needed the ship to be lighter so that they could get closer to the shore. That's what they needed. So they started throwing everything overboard, including the grain. There's something about a crisis that helps us define what really matters, what we really need. And in order to stand strong, there'll be times when it's necessary to divest yourself of unnecessary clutter and useless baggage. All of us have some amount of clutter in our lives. I'm not talking about my office here, okay? I know what some of y'all are thinking. Maybe it's a friendship or a relationship that isn't leading you into any kind of a good direction. Maybe it's a financial obligation that's draining your resources. Maybe we're wasting our time in an unproductive area, which prevents us from doing those things which really matter most. You may not be able to control the elements of the storm all around you, but you can strengthen your position when you lighten your load. Look at your life and ask yourself, what do I really need? What really matters most? What can I do without? Lighten your load and let go of some of the clutter. And thirdly, I encourage you to get ready to do your part. There are a lot of times that believers often want God to come into our difficult situations and just make everything right without any effort on our part. We want God to rescue us from the boat and drop us safely on shore without ever being inconvenienced at all. Well, that's not the way that it works most of the time. Most of the time, it works for us the way it worked for those on board the ship here in Acts. The boat was approaching the shore, and now look at verse 41. It says, but they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable, while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. They were so close. Still just a couple of 100 yards away. Still in a little bit of danger. So what do they do? Look in verses 43 and 44. It says, so he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks, some on debris from the ship. In this way, everyone safely reached the shore. When you're in the midst of chaos, there are times when you'll need to swim with all your might. And there are times when you'll need to hang on to a plank with all your might. But you need to do all of that you can do in order to simply get to shore. Do whatever you can to get to shore. God doesn't come into your life like some kind of a butler drawing your bath and brewing your tea and ironing your newspaper and helping you slip on your slippers. That's not the role that he plays in your life. God can get you through any chaotic situation, and you can be sure that he will, because you are immortal until your work on earth is done. But you can also be sure that in order to get through that chaos, you're going to have some skin in the game. You're going to have to do your part. You're going to have to swim or grab a hold of a piece of a driftwood and paddle your way to shore. Get there. Get that final 200 yards and make it to shore. Those who stand strong in a culture of chaos are those who refuse to surrender to the chaos. They won't just give up and give way to the storm and let it drive them along. And though they may momentarily be a victim of circumstance, they refuse to remain a victim of any kind for very long. Well, I got about 5 minutes left. A little late now. I didn't have the radio on. Sorry about that, Flo. Somebody should have told me earlier. Thanks for being here tonight. No, I'm kidding. I don't even know where I was now. Don't remain a victim. Thank you. And why will they not remain a victim? Because they know that God is in control. They know when he will see them through, that he will see them through no matter what is going to come their way. And for this reason, even during an extended season of not knowing, those who stand strong are able to say, I'm prepared to do my part. I'll take care of myself. I'll lighten my load where I can lighten it. And I'll swim as far as I need to swim. And when I can't swim anymore, I'm simply going to hang on to God's promise that he will see me through. You have no control over the chaos around you, but you have control over yourself. Whenever and wherever you can, make a leadership choice. Set a leadership example and be willing to do your part. Take out your prayer sheets, if you would.